or good afternoon, whichever one it is for you. We've been reading the BFG together, and it's such a great book. Sophie is just near and dear to our hearts, and so has the BFG become near and dear to our hearts. He's in a terrible place and in a terrible environment, and he's got terrible people surrounding him. And he has met this one delightful little girl, and I feel so good for him about that. Sophie, to live there the whole rest of her life, I feel kind of bad about that, but they have made quite a friendship together, and they're getting to know each other a little bit more every day. In the last chapter, they were galloping off to dream country to catch dreams. Whoever knew about that? You always wonder how you get dreams in there. Lo and behold, we didn't know that the giant peeks in our window and blows one right into your nose. You sniff it in, and then you are dreaming whatever that is. So remember, in his cave, he has rows and rows of jars on his walls, and each one is a different dream. And in our last chapter, he had caught a trouble humper, which is quite a terrible thing, I think. It's like a nightmare. And they had put it in the giant for him to dream. And he was thrashing around in the middle of his nightmare, and he started to hit the other giants that were around him. And they thought he was doing it on purpose. So pretty soon they had an all-out brawl between them. So anyway, we'll go back a little bit in our last chapter and warm our brains up to what was happening. That's always a good idea to do it. Put your bookmark in here and then back up just a little chunk just to kind of get you going. They'll kill each other, Sophie said. Never, the BFG answered. Those beasts is always bishing and walloping at one another. Soon it will be getting dusky, and they will be galloping off to fill their tummies. They're coarse and foul and filthy, Sophie said, and I hate them. As the BFG headed back into the cave, he said quietly, we certainly was putting that nightmare to good use, wasn't we? Excellent use, said Sophie. Well done, you. This chapter is called Dreams. The big friendly giant was seated at the great table in his cave, and he was doing his homework. Sophie sat cross-legged on the tabletop nearby watching him work. The glass jar containing the one and only good dream that they caught that day stood between them. The BFG, with great care and patience, was printing something on a piece of paper with an enormous pencil. What are you writing? Sophie asked him. Every dream is having a special label on the bottle, the BFG said. How else could I be finding the one I is wanting in a hurry? But can you really and truly tell what sort of a dream it is simply by listening to it? Sophie asked. I can, said the BFG, not looking up. But how? Is it by the way it hums and buzzes? You is less or more right, the BFG said. Every dream in the world is making a different sort of buzzy humming music, and these grand swabble-boggling ears of mine is able to read that music. By music, do you mean tunes? I is not meaning tunes. Then what do you mean? Human beings is having their own music. Is I right or is I left? You're right, said Sophie. Lots of music. And sometimes human beings is very overcome when they is hearing that wondrous music. They is getting shivers down their spindles. Is I right or is I left? Right again, Sophie said. So the music is saying something to them. It is sending a message. I do not think the human beings is knowing what the message is, but they is loving it all the same. That's about right, Sophie said. But just because of these jump-squiffling ears of mine, said the BFG, I is not only able to hear the music that is the dream is making, but I is also understanding it too. What do you mean understanding it? Sophie said. I can read it, the BFG said. It is talking to me like a language. I find that just a little hard to believe, Sophie said. I is betting you is also finding it hard to believe in Cogwinkle, said the BFG, and how they is visiting us from the stars. Of course I don't believe that, Sophie said. The BFG regarded her gravely with those huge eyes of his. I hope you will forgive me, he said, if I is telling you human beings is thinking they is very clever, but they is not. They is nearly all of them not munchers and squid peeps. I beg your pardon, said Sophie. The matter with human beings, the BFG went on, is that they is absolutely refusing to believe in anything unless they is actually seeing it right in front of their own schnoozles. Of course, Quogswinkles is existing. I is meeting them oftenly. I is even chittering to them. He turned away contemptuously from Sophie and resumed his writing. Sophie moved over to read what he had written so far. The letters were printed in big and bold, but they were not very well formed. Here is what it said. This dream is about how I is saving my teacher from drowning. I is diving into the river from a high bridge, and I is dragging my teacher to the bank, and then I is giving him the kiss of death. So each of these dreams, he's reading now what's on the labels, and then when that person sucks that dream in, that's exactly what they're going to be dreaming. The kiss of what? Said Sophie. The BFG stopped writing and raised his head slowly. His eyes rested on Sophie's face. I is telling you once before, he said. I is never having a chance to go to school. I is full of mistakes. They is not my fault. I do my best. You is a lovely little girl, but please remember that you is not exactly Miss Know Everything yourself. I'm sorry, said Sophie. I really am. It was very rude of me to keep correcting you. The BFG gazed at her for a while longer. Then he bent his head down to his slow, laborious writing. Tell me honestly, Sophie said, if you blew that dream into my bedroom when I was asleep, would I really start dreaming about how I saved my teacher from drowning by diving off a bridge? More, said the BFG, a lot more. But I cannot be squibbling the whole grobble-flunking dream on a titchy piece of paper. Of course there is more. The BFG laid down his pencil and placed one massive ear close to the jar. For about 30 seconds he listened intently. Yes, he said, nodding his great head solemnly up and down. This dream is continuing very nice. It has a very dory-hunky ending. How does it end? Said Sophie. Please tell me. You would be dreaming, the BFG said, that the morning after you was saving the teacher from the river, you was arriving at school, and you was seeing 500 pupils sitting in the assembly hall, and all of the teachers as well, and the head teacher is standing up and saying, I is wanting the whole school to give 3 cheers for Sophie because she is so brave and is saving the life of the fine arithmetic teacher, Mr. Figgins, who unfortunately pushed off the bridge into the river by our gym teacher, Miss Amelia Upscotch. So 3 cheers for Sophie. And the whole school is then cheering like mad and shouting, Bravo, well done. And forever after that, when you is getting your sums all gung-wizzled and muddled up, Mr. Figgins is always giving you 10 out of 10 and writing, Good work, Sophie, in your exercise book. Then you is waking up. Oh, I like that dream, said Sophie. Of course you like it, the BFG said. It is a fizz wizard. He licked the back of the label and stuck it on the jar. I is usually writing a bit more than this on the label, he said, but you is watching me and making me jumpsy. I'll go sit somewhere else, Sophie said. Oh, don't go, he said. Look in the jar carefully, and I think you is seeing the dream. Sophie peered into the jar, and there, sure enough, she saw a faint, translucent outline of something that was about the size of a hen's egg. There was just a touch of color in it, a pale sea green, soft, shimmering, and beautiful. There it lay, this small, oblong, sea green jellyish thing at the bottom of the jar, quite peacefully, but pulsing gently. The whole of it was moving in and out ever so slightly, as though it were breathing. It's moving, Sophie cried. It's alive. Of course it is alive. What will you feed it on? Sophie said. It is not needing any food, the BFG told her. That's cruel, said Sophie. Everything alive needs food of some sort, even trees and plants. The north wind is alive, said the BFG. It is moving, and it touches you on the cheek and hands, but nobody is feeding it. Sophie was silent. This extraordinary giant was disturbing her ideas. He seemed to be leading her towards mysteries that were beyond her understanding. A dream is not needing anything, the BFG went on. If it is a good one, it is waiting peaceably forever until it is released and allowed to do its job. If it is a bad one, it is always fighting to get out. The BFG stood up and walked over to one of the many shelves and placed the latest jar up amongst the thousands of others. Please, could I look at some of the other dreams? Sophie asked. The BFG hesitated. Nobody has ever seen them before, he said, but perhaps after all I is letting you have a little peep. He picked her up off the table and stood her on the palm of his huge hand. He carried her toward the shelves. "Over here is some of the dreams," he said. "These is Fizz Wizards." "Would you hold me closer so I could read the labels?" Sophie said. "My labels is always telling a little bit of it," the BFG said. "The dreams is usually much longer. The labels is just to remind me." Sophie started to read the labels. The first one seemed long enough to her. It went all the way around the jar, and as she read it, she had to keep turning the jar. This is what it said. "Today I is sitting in class, and I discovered that if I is staring very hard at my teacher in a special way, I is able to put her to sleep. So I keep staring at her, and in the end, her head drops on her desk, and she goes fast to sleep and snorkles loudly. Then in marches the head teacher, and he shouts, 'Wake up, Miss Plumridge! How dare you go to sleep in class? Go fetch your hat and coat, and leave this school forever. You is sacked.' But in a jiffy, I is putting the head teacher to sleep as well, and he just crumples slowly to the floor like a lump of jelly, and there he lies all in a heap and starts snorkeling even louder than Miss Plumridge. And then I is hearing my mummy's voice saying, 'To wake up, your breakfast is ready.'" "That is a funny dream," Sophie said. "It is a ring beller," said the BFG. "It is a wopsy." Inside the jar, just below the edge of the label, Sophie could see the putting to sleep dream lying peacefully on the bottom, pulsing gently, sea green like the other ones, but perhaps a trifle larger. "Do you have separate dreams for boys and girls?" Sophie asked. "Of course," the BFG said. "If I is giving a girl a dream to a boy, or even if it is a really wopsy girl's dream, the boy would be waking up and thinking, 'That was a rock-spunkling, grig-spunkling old dream it was.'" "Boys would," said Sophie. "These here is all girl dreams on this shelf," said the BFG. "Could I read a boy's dream?" "You can," said the BFG. He lifted her to a higher shelf. The label on the nearest boy dream jar read as follows: "I is making myself a marvelous pair of suction boots, and when I is putting them on, I is able to walk straight up the kitchen wall and across the ceiling. Well, I is walking upside down on the ceiling when my big sister comes in, and she is staring at me, starting to yell at me when she always does, yelling, 'What on earth is you doing up there walking on the ceiling?' And I looks down at her and I smiles and I said, 'I told you you was driving me up the wall, and now you has done it.'" "Oh, I find that one rather silly," Sophie said. "Boys wouldn't," said the BFG, grinning. "It is another ring beller. Perhaps you has seen enough now." "Oh, please let me read another boy's one," Sophie said. The next label said, "The telephone rings in our house, and my father picks it up, and he says in his very important telephone voice, 'Simpkins speaking.' And then his face goes white, and his voice goes all funny, and he says, 'What? Who?' And then he says, 'Yes, sir. I understand, sir. But surely it is me who is wishing to speak to, sir, not my little son.' My father's face is going from white to dark purple, and he is gulping like he has a lobster stuck in his throat. And then at last he is saying, 'Yes, sir. Very well, sir. I will get him, sir.' And he turns to me and he says in a rather respectful voice, 'If you is knowing the President of the United States?' And I says, 'No, but I expect he is hearing about me.' Then I is having a long talk on the phone and saying things like, 'Let me take care of it, Mr. President. You'll bungle it up if you do it your way.' And my father's eyes is googling right out of his head, and that is when I is hearing my father's real voice saying, 'Get up, you lazy slob, or you will be late for school.'" "Boys are crazy," Sophie said. "Let me read the next one." She started out reading the label. "I is having a bath, and I is discovering that if I press quite hard on my tummy button, a funny feeling comes over me, and suddenly my legs is not there, and not in my arms. In fact, I has become absolutely invisible all over. I is still there, but no one can see me, not even myself. So my mummy comes in and she says, 'Where is that child? He is in the bath a minute ago, and he can't possibly have washed himself properly.' So I says, 'Here I is.' And she says, 'Where?' And I says, 'Here.' And she says, 'Where?' And I says, 'Here.' And she yells, Henry, come up here quick. And when my daddy rushes in, I is washing myself, and my daddy sees the soap floating around in the air. But of course he is not seeing me, and he shouts, "Where are you, boy?" And I says, "Here." And he says, "Where?" And I says, "Here." And he says, "Where?" And I says, "Here." And he says, "The soap, boy, the soap, it is flying in the air." Then I press my tummy button again, and now I is visible. My daddy is squiffy with excitement, and he says, "You is the invisible boy." And I says, "Now I is going to have some fun." So when his eye is out of the bath, and I have dried myself and put on my dressing gown and slippers, I press my tummy button again, and I become invisible and go down to the town and walk in the streets. Of course, only me is visible, but not the things that I is wearing. So when people is seeing a dressing gown and slippers floating along the street with nobody in it, there is a panic with everybody yelling, "A ghost! A ghost!" And people is screaming left and right, and big, strong policemen is running for their lives. And best of all, I see Mr. Grummet, my algebra teacher, coming out of a pub, and I is floating up to him and says, "Boo!" And he lets out a frightsome howl and dashes back to the pub, and then I is waking up feeling happy as a squid whiffler. "That's pretty ridiculous," Sophie said. All the same, she couldn't resist reaching down and pressing her own tummy button to see if it worked. Nothing happened. "Dreams is very mystical things," the BFG said. "Human beings is not understanding them at all. Not even their brainiest professors is understanding them. Have you seen enough?" "Oh, just this last one," said Sophie. "This one here." She started reading. "I has written a book, and it is so exciting nobody can put it down. As soon as you has read the first line, you is so hooked on it, you cannot stop until the last page. In all the cities, people is walking in the streets, bumping into each other because their faces is buried in my book, and dentists is reading it and trying to fill teeth at the same time. But nobody minds because they is all reading it in the dentist chair. Drivers is reading it while they is driving, and cars is crashing all over the country. Brain surgeons is reading it while they is operating on brains, and airline pilots is reading it and going to the Timbuktu instead of London. Football players is reading it on the field because they can't put it down, and it is so Olympic runners while they is running. Everybody has to see what is going on, what is going to happen next to my book, and when I wake up, I is still tingling with excitement at being the greatest writer in the world, until my mommy comes in and says, "I was looking at your English exercise book last night, and really your spelling is atrocious, and your punctuation." "That is enough for now," the BFG said. "There is dillions more, but my arm is getting tired of holding you up." "What are those over there?" Sophie said. "Why have they got such tiny labels?" "That," said the BFG, "is because one day I is catching so many dreams, I is not having time or energy to write long labels. But there is enough there to remind me." "Could I just look at those?" Sophie said. The long-suffering BFG carried her across to the jars. Sophie read them rapidly, one after another. "I is climbing up Mount Everest with just my pussycat for company." Here's another one. "I is inventing a car that runs on toothpaste." "I is able to make the electric lights go on and off just by wishing it." "I is only 8 years old and a little boy, but I is growing a splendid bushy beard, and all the other boys is jealous." "I is able to jump out of any high window and float down safely." "I has a pet bee that makes rock and roll music when it flies." Whoops. "What amazes me," Sophie said, "is how you ever learned to write in the first place." "Ah," said the BFG, "I has been wondering how long it is before you was asking me that." "Considering you never went to school, I think it's quite marvelous," said Sophie. "How did you learn?" The BFG crossed the cave and opened a tiny secret door in the wall. He took out a book, a very old and tattered book. By human standards, it was an ordinary-sized book, but it looked like a little postage stamp in his hand. "One night," he said, "I is blowing a dream through a window, and I sees a book lying on the little boy's bedroom table. I wanted it very badly, you understand, but I is refusing to steal it. I would never do that. So how did you get it? Said Sophie. I is borrowing it, said the BFG, smiling a little. Just for the short time I borrowed it. How long have you had it? Sophie asked. Oh, perhaps about 80 years, the BFG said. Soon I shall be putting it back. And that's how you taught yourself to write? Sophie asked him. I is reading it hundreds of times, said the BFG, and I is still reading it, and I is teaching myself words and how to write them. It is the most scrumptious story. Sophie took the book out of his hand. Nicholas Nickleby, she read out loud. By Dolls Chickens, the BFG said. By who? Sophie said. Just then, there came a tremendous galloping noise of feet from outside the cave. What's that? Sophie cried. That is all the giants zip-fizzling off to another country to guzzle human beings, the BFG said. He quickly popped Sophie into his waistcoat pocket, and he hurried to the cave entrance and rolled back the stone. Sophie peeped out of her spy hole, and she saw all 9 fearsome giants coming past at a full gallop. Where is you off to tonight? Shouted the BFG. We is all of us off to Flushbunkling, England tonight, said the flesh lump eater as they went galloping past. England has luscious land, and we is fancying a few nice little English chidlers. I, shouted the maid masher, as knowing where a giggle house for girls is, and I is guzzling myself as a froth blower. I is knowing where there is a boggle box for boys, shouted the gizzard gulper. All I has to do is reach in and grab myself a handful. English boys is tasting extra liquishy. In a few seconds, all 9 galloping giants were out of sight. What did he mean? Sophie said, poking her head out of her pocket. What is a giggle house for girls? He is meaning a girls' school, the BFG said. He will be eating them tonight by the bundle. Oh no, Sophie cried. And boys from the boys' school, the BFG said. It mustn't happen, Sophie cried out. We've got to stop him. We can't just sit here and do nothing. There is not a thing we can do, the BFG said. We is helpless as horse feathers. He sat down on a craggy blue rock near the entrance to the cave. He took Sophie from his pocket and put her beside him on a rock. It is now quite safe for you to be outside until day is coming back, he said. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and it was getting dark. So we're halfway. The next chapter is called The Great Plan. So we got a little peek inside the BFG's cave at all the walls and walls and walls of thousands and thousands of dreams. Sophie got to read some of the labels that told a little bit about each dream. Wouldn't it be fun to be able to go pick out the dream you wanted to dream that night and have him puff it in, and then you could dream anything you wanted to? So I hope you enjoyed our chapter today. We'll be back tomorrow with a chapter called The Great Plan. All right, have a great rest of your day. I will see you right back here tomorrow. Bye.